What's up, guys? It's the Bluebloods, and we're coming back at you with another huge episode. We're joined by a very special guest today on the podcast. He is currently the sideline reporter for the Georgia Bulldogs and co-host of the Bulldogs Gameweek. Mr. Chuck Dowdle is with us today, and we just want to say we appreciate you joining us today.
Guys, glad to be there. I mean, it's a pleasure to, have an opportunity to be on your podcast.
I definitely appreciate it. I feel like it's only right to start with last season for the Bulldogs, a trip to Atlanta, the SEC championship. Nothing to be disappointed about there, but
are you kidding?
But I mean, there seem to be some people critical, but just overall as a season, did this team meet, exceed, or fall just below your preseason expectations?
I think last year it was a team that exceeded expectations on one side of the football and fell demonstrably short on the other side. If coming out of spring practice and the G-Day game, I remember full well everybody saying, boy, we're just going to have to outscore everybody, which we can do because our defense isn't very good. But it turned out to be just the opposite. Our defense was outstanding. Our offense struggled, and that was kind of a surprise. I think more of a disappointment than anything else during the season was we just never were able to really get in sync offensively. We were able to obviously beat a lot of teams, and but never with the authority and never with the consistency on the offensive side of the football that we had all anticipated coming out of spring practice and last year's G-Day game.
Right, and kind of sticking with that, a lot of fans, or at least people I knew around Georgia and just SEC football, were very critical of quarterback Jake Fromm, and I probably think that doesn't help that Justin Fields had the season he had at Ohio State. Do you think the criticism of Fromm is fair, or can you maybe let us and our listeners know why he may be overlooked or maybe even underappreciated?
I think it was fair. I think Jake was fairly critical of his play. There were some throws he made during the course of the season that I know he'd love to have back. One that he made against South Carolina just before the half. Georgia was going into driving on a drive to go in and take a nice lead into the locker room at halftime. And he made a poor pass, and it was picked off in return for a touchdown. South Carolina goes on to win that football game. Now, there were other things that contributed to it, of course, but that was a key play in the game, and we saw that too often. Some of that had to do with the fact that Georgia had lost, a good number of their really quality receivers that Jake had depended so prominently on the year before. And so I think that figured into it. But as to whether or not that was the key reason for the offensive performance last year, I'd be hesitant to say that. I think the offensive line, which was supposed to be a big strength for Georgia, I think at times it struggled. So there were a number of things that contributed to the offense, but fortunately, like I said earlier, defensively, that was an area where we thought we were going to have trouble coming out of G-Day, and defensively, Georgia was as good, if not better, than anybody in the country.
Right, absolutely. I have to agree with you 100% there. And going into last season, many experts expected big things from Jake Fromm, DeAndre Swift, and so on. I mean, like you said, this offense was highly touted going into the season, but the defense seemed to be the main star there. But was there one player that really surprised you or had a breakout season this past year?
One player that had a breakout season, there's no question. If you're going to pick one guy that just really, if for no other reason than the fact that he was a true freshman, but George Pickens, he started out a little slowly, and then, boy, when he got the hang of it, he was something to watch. And, he clearly is going to be a dominant player in the Southeastern Conference. And so as a true freshman last year, I thought he had a great breakout year. I was really proud of the year that George Pickens had.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he is – if you can't tell right now, he's going to be a star for everybody listening out there. But I want to move on.
There's no question. That young man, he's at a level that you just don't see out of a true freshman. Now, I got to tell you, Dominic Blaylock also played well. So, he played well too, but he just doesn't quite have that spectacular catchability that this young man seems to. Baylor tried everything in the world to cover him in the first half of the Sugar Bowl this past year, and just couldn't do it. I mean, they just couldn't cover him, and you see why Georgia is so excited to have that young man back now coming in for his sophomore season. He's a guy that Georgia flipped on National Signing Day from Auburn. He had been committed to Auburn, and then day of signing, he flips and signs with Georgia. And there were a lot of folks in Alabama that weren't real happy.
Right. No, there's no doubt about that. Moving into next season just a little bit, we can't really kick off this interview without talking a little bit about Jamie Newman. We see him transferring from Wake Forest, and he's projected to step into the QB1 role in Athens. So what are your first impressions of Jamie Newman? What do you expect him to bring to Athens?
First off, a lot of maturity. Young man, has experience. He's not unaccustomed to being the guy. He certainly was that at Wake Forest. He's going to step into a role where he's going to have to be the guy for the Georgia Bulldogs. He has a lot of talent with throwing the football, great arm, but a lot of accuracy, particularly on the deep ball. He is very good throwing deep passes. And then he's got that scrambling ability that Jake didn't have. Now, Jake brings a lot of things to the picnic, but maneuverability in the pocket wasn't one of them. And this young man has that, and he's got size and speed. He's a Justin Fields wannabe. I don't think he's quite just a tick behind. He's that good a quarterback based on what I've seen of his video at Wake Forest and what I've seen of the workouts that he's put in at Georgia. I think that he's a guy that, Kirby Smart, you don't pull the wool over his eyes very often. And I think once he had an inkling that Jake Fromm may be looking at greener pastures in the NFL, then I think at that point, Kirby started to look around, and this was a guy that he, set his sights on. And lo and behold, when you know it, Jamie Newman ends up in Athens almost instantly. And so this is a young man that's going to be, quite a catch for Georgia. Now the question becomes, with a new offensive coordinator, Todd Monken, can they put it all together? They got a lot of holes in that offensive line to fill. Can they do that? However, I think that Jamie Newman's a guy that can make it happen.
Right. And you talked about Jake Fromm already. I mean, you talked about Kirby Smart maybe seeing him moving on to greener pastures. He went to the NFL draft. I know that I was fairly critical of that decision. I thought maybe he could have benefited from another year in Athens. But what was the – right, yeah. That was my question. I want to know what you thought about it, maybe what the maybe consensus – view on this was in Athens.
Well, I think it was I think most people really hated to see Jake go, maybe selfishly. I felt, just from looking at Jake play, I thought that my feeling was he wasn't quite where he needed to be to go to the NFL. Now, we'll wait and see. He certainly dropped in the draft, but Jake is the kind of guy that you knew that the process, and when I say the process, you knew the process was not going to be kind to. And by that, I mean, look, when he went to the combine, you knew he was not going to blow guys away with his speed, with his arm strength, with his regular strength. I mean, he's just not that kind of an athlete. You knew where he would blow people away would be with an interview. You could put any defense you wanted to up on a chalkboard, and Jake could look at it and tell you immediately where the ball needed to go. I mean, that was his strength. But was that going to be enough to get him a high draft selection? And I didn't feel going into it that it would. I thought the process would not treat him well, and that's exactly what happened. And he dropped down the draft board. Now, that doesn't mean that Jake Fromm won't have a good NFL career, because we certainly hope that he does. I mean, we love that young man. He is sharp and is wonderful to be around. I mean, he's a leader. He's got so many attributes that you look for, not just in a quarterback, but in a teammate. And so, I hope he gets the opportunity to really show himself and not have to step into it too quickly, that he can be brought along slowly, and given that opportunity, I think he could, have a nice NFL career. But he's not the kind of guy that's going to go in and wow you.
Right. And so, like, you talk about Jake Fromm's one of the players that left for the draft. I mean, we saw Georgia lose other players such as DeAndre Swift, Andrew Thomas, Isaiah Wilson. All these players went to the draft. There's a lot of open roles that younger players must step into next season, sort of like George Pickens did this past season. Can you give our listeners some insight on some players to watch out for next season that you really see breaking onto the scene next season?
As I pointed out earlier, Georgia's got a lot of places on offense that they've got to get help. A guy that I'm looking anxious to see and hoping that we get the opportunity to see him, that's also very much up in the air, is the running back out of California, Kendall Milton. He's a big kid. He reminds you a lot in appearance of Todd Gurley. He runs a little more like Todd than you. Doesn't have quite the speed that Todd Gurley has, but he runs that kind of upright. You know what I'm talking about? He you know how Todd sort of runs upright, and he's got that kind of upright gait to him when he takes off with the football. And if he can take the beating, because when you run like that, that gives defenders in the SEC a pretty big target. But if this young man, if he can, take some hits and get the opportunity, I think he could be a real plus for Georgia. And I'm excited to see him. Right.
I think you see that running style being more common, especially with someone like Todd Gurley. Even Derrick Henry has that sort of gliding, upright running style. But, looking at Georgia's schedule, I mean, the obvious tough games that are always there are there in Auburn and Florida. Those are always dragged down physical games. But the week 3 game being in Tuscaloosa against Alabama is different. That's unique for this year. I mean, how big is this game for the Bulldogs, and will this game for you set the tone for how this season is going to turn out?
No, I don't think it'll do that. They had 2 really great games against Alabama and lost them both. It's time, and so you need to step into it this year and win this against Alabama, or win a national championship against Alabama and take control of the SEC. I think Georgia's on that path, and that's kind of where Kirby has his hat set, is to beat Alabama. And to beat Alabama, you need to beat Alabama. And so for that reason, I think it's an important game. But will it define Georgia's season? I don't think so. I think it's entirely possible. And I'm assuming here now, we're facing an awful lot of issues between now and September 7th when we kick off the season, or are scheduled to kick off the season at Mercedes-Benz Stadium against Virginia. We got a lot of hurdles to clear between now and then. But assuming that is the case, and we are going to play a regular season, that 3rd game of the year, you could see a repeat of that in the SEC championship game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if that game, doesn't come out in Georgia's favor, I mean, who's to say that defines them? And it doesn't define them. Like you said, I mean, we saw Georgia have a loss to South Carolina this past season. They still ended up in the SEC championship. I mean, it's just things in the SEC can't be defined by one game. Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
But you never know in the conference. You just it's definitely it's the reason that the SEC is where it is on the college football stage. It's the big dog, and everybody knows it. But right. You don't know from week to week, what awaits you. But if you're not ready on any given week, you're going to get embarrassed. Georgia, as we mentioned, found that out against South Carolina last year, but other teams have found it out against Georgia. So, it's a great conference. And for that reason, we've really got our fingers crossed that we can play a full schedule and play a full SEC schedule.
Right, absolutely. And building off of that, looking ahead at next season, we like to ask this to any guest that we have on, no matter what team they represent. What do you see the ceiling for the Bulldogs this upcoming year, and what do you see as the floor for Georgia?
What do I see as the ceiling for them? The ceiling and the floor. The ceiling for me would be to run the table, because I think Georgia has so many talented players. Kirby Smart and the staff that he has assembled, not just this year, but the one he had last year and the one the year before that and the one the year before that. They've done such a great job of stocking 4- and 5-star talent on that roster that you expect great things every year, as well you should. I mean, when you see talented players time and time again committing and signing to one school, you expect that school to be pretty good. So the ceiling is high. The expectations are high. Where the floor would be, I think for Georgia, I think if you lose more than 2 games, I think it's a real disappointment. I think a two-loss season would be a loss to Alabama, and if Florida were to find a way, and I don't think they will, but if Florida were to find a way to beat Georgia and Georgia would have 2 losses, I think that would be about as low as Georgia can go. I don't think anybody else on that schedule is capable of beating Georgia. And start with Virginia. They're certainly not. I don't think that you will see anybody else on the SEC schedule or on their outside the conference schedule, non-conference schedule, beat them. Maybe Alabama, maybe Florida. So I think it's that narrow, between the ceiling and the floor.
Right. That one's got to hurt, Zach.
Yeah, that one hurts me being an Auburn graduate. That one that one stung my soul a little bit, but I understand.
Auburn's got to come to Athens this year. Auburn has to come to Athens. And I think right now, I think Georgia's just a tick ahead of where Auburn is. Just in recruiting. If you just look at the players that Georgia has stacked on their roster, listen, Kirby has come in here and he set the world on fire. He has brought in 5-star after 5-star after 5-star, and he's got guys behind guys behind guys. And what it enables him to do, as Kirby, if he was sitting here, he's told me many times, he would tell you what it enables him to do is practice the way he loves to practice, which is hard and physical, because you don't worry if a guy gets hurt. Guess what? You got 2 more waiting just as good to step into his place. And that's what he loves. He loves to be able to practice with hard physical practices.
Love it.
Yeah. I'm not going to argue with you. Georgia is definitely from top to bottom more talented than Auburn. It's just a homer over here with me. But, you did talk about
Listen, I got to tell you something. I feel strong. I am – listen, you can't tell me anything more about Auburn than I already know. I've always felt like there has to be – for people that can't get into college, there has to be a place to. And I feel very strongly about that. So I totally understand and appreciate Auburn.
I got you there, but you talk about Kirby Smart. You talk about Kirby Smart, and I really wanted to talk about him on the podcast. We have a long list of Kirby Smart questions here. I mean, he came to Athens in 2016 from Tuscaloosa, and I was at a few games in his first season, and it was an up and down year. But what were your first impressions of Kirby? And based off that 2016 season, did you honestly see the trajectory that this team was going to take after that first season?
Oh, yeah. I'll tell you this story. Kirby would tell you the same. He was totally – if there was one thing Kirby did not know and never expected was he did not think that a freshman quarter – okay, he comes to Georgia in 2016. His starting quarterback is Jacob Eason. And Jacob Eason has to play most of the year. And then I think Georgia went, if I recall, 8-5. And Easton's a quarterback. And so the next year, Kirby's really pumped up because he thinks, okay, now I've got a quarterback that's not a freshman anymore. He's a sophomore. He's going to really step up and really help us because he's going to, got that year of experience. He's been in the system. He knows what we expect. And then the first game, that very first game, in Athens, what happens like on the second series, when he went out, they thought the injury was perhaps season ending for him. They did not know at that particular time that Easton would in fact be able to rehab and come back in about 4 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. But at the time they thought that he was done for the year. In comes Jake Fromm. Well, Georgia wins that game. They had to kind of, tone down the offense, but, he wasn't expected to. He thought Jacob Easton was going to be the guy. Well, we win the game. We come in the locker room, and, normally you're pretty excited about an season opening win. And Kirby's sitting there next to me. We're waiting to do radio, and he's kind of rubbing his eyes and his head, and I said, "You okay?" And he looked at me. He says, "Yeah." He said, "I just can't believe I've got to play another year with a freshman quarterback." And little did he know, that freshman quarterback the next week goes up to South Bend, and in his first start on the road in that atmosphere against one of the most iconic programs in the history of college football, he beats them. And then from there, it just took off. And then when Easton did come back, he couldn't win the job back. So I think at the end of that year, if you want to know a difference between Kirby Smart now and Kirby Smart then, is that then Kirby Smart didn't think a true freshman quarterback could take you anywhere. I think he feels differently now. I think Jake Fromm taught him that lesson. You can take I'm sure they worked hard with him, but you can take a true freshman quarterback that's got talent and ability and leadership skills, and you can get a lot done.
Right. And if anyone's going to teach you that, it's Jake Fromm. I mean, good Lord.
Kirby's biggest strength is recruiting, which you kind of highlighted earlier in the show. I mean, most evident the number one class, according to 247 Sports last year. And I just thought it stuck out to me that out of the 5 stars that Kirby landed, he got them out of Arizona, Georgia, Florida, Nevada. In your opinion, how does he continually land the biggest recruits in the country, and how does his reach stretch all the way to the West Coast like it does currently?
Well, there have been a number of things that have helped. The fact that Georgia had such a great year, and it's in his second season, when they had that fabulous Rose Bowl win that, captivated the nation. I think a lot of kids out west saw Georgia in that Rose Bowl and thought, I could play for that guy. I'd love to go play for that school. I think that helped. But I do think also Kirby can go get anybody. If you ever have the opportunity, each and every week after games, I'm in a locker room where Kirby's talking to these kids. And I got to tell you something. He connects with these kids like nothing you have ever seen. He'll step up on a stool in the middle. He'll tell everybody to take a knee after a game. He'll step up on a stool. He'll start talking to them. That head will start bouncing and that hair flopping around. And you look in those kids' eyes and they're mesmerized. I mean, he has their attention. He has absolutely, he gets out of them what he wants. And he lets them know about it if it's not what he wants. And there's no mistaking. He is terrific at that. He connects with these young men like nothing I've ever seen. After that Rose Bowl win out in Pasadena, he came into that locker room. Now, you overtime, you come from behind, you beat Oklahoma, and you win it in sudden death in overtime. And what happens? Kirby comes in that locker room. Now, that's the semifinal game. Now you're going to the national championship game. And he steps up on a stool and gets those kids down in front of him, and he says, guys, we're not celebrating. We'll have time to celebrate this later on. Back across the country and get off our feet and get some rest so that we can start a full week of preparation for a national championship. And let's not be celebrating this. We'll have a chance to celebrate a big Rose Bowl win later. But right now, let's do what's what's the best thing for this team to be prepared to feel underway at the time next week.
So I mentioned the transfer of Jamie Newman earlier, but there was another big-time transfer who'll be arriving very soon in JT Daniels. What's your opinion on Daniels? Yeah, and what do you think that Daniels has the opportunity to push Newman out of the starting spot this season if he's eligible?
If he's and you hit the big if he's eligible. I will tell you this. I talked today. I'm not sure if you're familiar with a gentleman named Rusty Mansell, one of the top recruiting analysts in the country, if not the best. But Rusty told me this morning that he felt. Now take it back that he didn't feel, but he had talked to people in JT Daniels' circle, and they all felt very strongly that he was going to get a clearance waiver from the NCAA to be eligible immediately for Georgia. That he had lawyered up very heavily, had a good case, and felt that the NCAA was going to grant him the waiver. So if that, and I got to tell you, I've had Rusty Mansell tell me very few things that didn't come to pass. So if that indeed happens, I don't think he's the kind of kid that right this minute can push Jamie Newman because of Jamie Newman's experience. JT Daniel got hurt in his freshman year, and he's been out a while. I think it's going to take him a little while to kind of get back to where he was. But I do think that that's a talented young man that will serve Georgia well down the road and would be a great backup to have on this roster, would certainly give Kirby Smart and his staff a little bit of an air of not so worried about what happens with Jamie Newman on the field.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. And to say that he would be a great backup, I mean, that's even an understatement, honestly.
Yeah.
But I want to go ahead and shift to a big debate that we've had on this podcast, and Zach and I have even had personally. But it does involve Georgia. ESPN released their rankings of position U and did not include Georgia in their top 10 teams for this one position. Zach choose running back. Exactly. Zach picked Georgia as his number one RBU. I had them in my top 3, I believe. So why do you think Georgia got overlooked in this discussion or in this list?
I wondered that at the time. I have no idea. Sometimes I wonder what goes through. Listen, there were people that didn't vote Hank Aaron into the Hall of Fame on the first ballot. So,
That's true.
If I start trying to figure out what on earth was that journalist thinking, when they did that, we'll be driving ourselves crazy. But I do think that Georgia can make a strong case for it. Auburn can make a strong case for it. There are a lot of schools that can Southern Cal can make a strong case for it. There are a lot of schools out there that have a history of turning out great running backs. I think Georgia has turned out the greatest. That's my personal opinion. And at number 34, I think there are a lot of people that still look at that guy and say, I think we could suit him up next week. He could get us probably 75 to 100 yards. Oh, yeah. But I do think that Georgia has, they grabbed that moniker a long time ago, and they really haven't let it go. They have turned out a Todd Gurley and a Nick Chubb and a Noshawn Marino, now DeAndre Swift. I mean, there are a lot of great backs that come out of Georgia, and they continue to come to Georgia because they know they're going to get the football.
Right. And, I mean, to be fair, on the podcast, we had a greatest player bracket in change of March Madness, and Herschel Walker was both our pick for the greatest player of all time. Even as an Auburn fan, I'm picking Herschel Walker here. So I think it's pretty clear that Herschel Walker is respected by fans all across the country, to say the least. And we talk about this position you think, and there is one that ESPN did have Georgia ranked number 1, and that's linebacker. And we talked about this on the podcast. I personally think Roquan Smith is probably the best linebacker in recent college football history, and I think he added a lot of value to the position for Georgia. Can you speak on what you saw from Roquan and what he brought to the Bulldogs defense and what made him so special? And then can you also highlight some linebackers that an average fan might not know that also probably should be mentioned here in this linebacker debate?
Wow. Well, he was a Butkus Award winner, out of the gate. That says something. Roquan had speed. Has speed. I shouldn't say had speed. He could cover sideline to sideline. He had a certain tenacity, that the only other player that I could compare that I saw on a week in, week out basis with Georgia was back when Jarvis Jones was playing for Georgia. He had a knack. Jarvis Jones had a knack for making the big play at just the right time, just when Georgia needed it. And Roquan had that same ability. He'd come up with the big fumble, or he'd make the big hit, or break up a pass, or do something that was a big play at a big moment in a game. And that's what big players do. That's what the great players do. But I got to tell you, as far as linebackers go, I would think Roquan is probably, if he's not the best in recent years, he's certainly in the top 2 or 3. I'm reluctant to say who I would pick, because doing Georgia football, one of the things that's great about it is I get to see great players every week. But what's kind of the other side is I really don't get to see on a consistent basis guys that are really good players for other teams. I hope that makes sense to you. I'm trying to remember the young man's name. There was a linebacker that was with, I want to say it was one of the lesser teams, like Vandy or Missouri or somebody, that we saw one that I was told in advance that this was a guy that Georgia was going to have to stop. And it turned out, I know who it was. It was the kid for Kentucky.
Josh Allen?
Pardon?
Was it Josh Allen?
That's exactly right. Josh, I couldn't think of his name. Josh Allen. And, we'd heard about was, you couldn't block him. You couldn't stop him. You had to, well, guess what? He did nothing against Georgia. If I had to come away and judge Josh Allen based on what I saw of him, in that one game, I'd have thought, boy, who are people looking at? And so that's one of the disadvantages to what I do is being with Georgia. I don't get to see other guys. Clearly that was not the case. Obviously, he did not have a great game against Georgia, but obviously also he had a lot of great games against other teams because, he was getting recognition, coast to coast. There were billboards. There were billboards up with that guy's, picture on them. So, that's the one bad thing about what I do is, I get to see our guys, but I don't get to make judgments that often on guys on other teams.
Right. So we only have a couple more questions left, but we'd like to end this interview talking about your time at Georgia, talking about your career and your time working on the sidelines. So we've seen some legendary games involving the Bulldogs and some amazing players, to say the least. What game throughout your career has really stuck out to you as one game that you'll never forget? Or are there a few of them? Or I guess I just said one because that's typically what we like to stick to.
Yeah, there's so many. If you ask me about my whole career, I was at when Doug Flutie threw the Hail Mary against Miami in the Orange Bowl. I was at that game. So I saw that. And then I got to tell you something. Then I saw a Hail Mary, that Tennessee threw against Georgia in Athens. I was on the wrong side of both of those Hail Marys, by the way.
Oh man!
But yeah, I've seen a lot of great games. I've been fortunate and been blessed to be in a business where I've been around a lot of great athletes and seen some terrific football games. I'll tell you, I would rank right up there. Certainly the Georgia-Alabama game that was the national championship game, that was a great game. The Georgia-Oklahoma game in the Rose Bowl, that was a great game. But I thought the Georgia-Alabama game SEC championship game with Aaron Murray, when Todd Gurley, and then with that last play, when you'll recall that because they tipped the ball, we catch it, but time expires. Down Georgia couldn't get off another play, but they had driven down with Aaron Murray had taken them on a great drive. How about the one in Auburn? How about that game where Auburn hits the prayer at Jordan Hare? That was, and I'll tell you a funny story about that one. Is that I was so mad I took off my headset and I just went storming into the locker room, knowing that we had lost the game. And I go back in the locker room and I'm sitting back in the back of where Coach Rick's got to come when the game's over and the team comes in, and suddenly the assistant equipment manager comes back and says, "You better get back out there. Aaron's got us at the 20-yard line." I went, "What?" And Aaron Murray had brought the Georgia team, if you'll recall, back down the field, and actually Georgia had a chance to get it in the end zone and win still.
Right.
Yeah, that was a crazy, crazy game. And I was actually at the Tennessee-Georgia game where Tennessee hit the Hail Mary, and that was easily one of the craziest games I think I've ever personally been to. And I've been to a lot, but I was with a bunch of Georgia fans, and to say the car ride home was not as enjoyable as I would have liked.
Yeah, I'm sure. I am sure. But that was one of those where, the Tennessee fans were stunned, and then suddenly the Georgia fans were stunned. And it was, you had two teams snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, and it was one I'll never forget, and I'm sure Coach Smart will never forget. But it was his first year, and things have definitely been on the uptick since.
That's true. And so we got one last question here. And like I said, I've personally been to Athens multiple times, saw some big-time games. I was at the Georgia-Alabama game there. I saw Georgia beat Auburn in 2016 when Auburn came in a top 10 team. But can you kind of convey to our listeners what makes Athens so special on game day, and what makes Sanford Stadium one of the best stadiums in college football on Saturdays?
So you've got 90, and it's and the atmosphere in there is just electric every time Georgia takes the field. But it's a special little town. They say Athens is the ultimate college town, and it really is. You walk down just steps from Sanford Stadium, and you are in a mix of little bars and restaurants and just fans all over the street. It's got a feel to it on game day that is unlike anywhere else. It really is. It's a special place for people to come to see. And the sad part right now as we sit here today, guys, is that, we don't know what that's going to be this year. And we've got, like I said earlier, we got a lot of hurdles to clear between now and the time that we can get to where we want to be. And what we're hoping is that everybody will do as their health officials are asking them to do, and wear masks and socially distance and, wash their hands and do the things to try to help us get to where we want to be. And where we want to be at Jordan Hare Stadium, and we want to be at Sanford Stadium. And, we want to be, at Bryant Denny Stadium and all the great iconic venues around the SEC, watching what we love to watch on fall afternoons in the South, and that's SEC football.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree at all there, but that is a wrap on our interview. We want to thank you so much for coming on, especially in a time like this, and just dropping all this knowledge about Georgia football with us.
Well, listen, I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate you guys bringing a little interest and a lot of enthusiasm to SEC football, and for this podcast, at least, to the Georgia Bulldogs.
That's right. We talk a lot of SEC. We're a college football podcast. We talk a lot of SEC since we were both, Brandon grew up LSU fan. I went to Auburn, and so we talk a lot of SEC football here. But if we have a season this fall, which I know we all hope we do, we definitely look forward to having you on for some of these big Georgia games coming up.
Well, I'll look forward to it. You reach out anytime, and I appreciate the invitation, and go Dogs.
That's right. But, guys, that is a wrap on this interview. I'm not going to drop any of our social media. You guys know what that is. But we'll be back next week with some more big episodes, so stay tuned for that. But for right now, we're out.